Mall manager kicks out woman for Harris-Walz hat. Unaware, she owns the mall. The mall thrived with its usual chaos. Bright lights reflected off the polished floors, a cacophony of shoppers' chatter intermingled with upbeat holiday music. Storefronts gleamed with extravagant displays, and the air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from a nearby kiosk. For most, it was just another busy day. But for Harold Greaves, it was a day to assert his authority. Harold, the mall's general manager, stood near the central atrium with his arms crossed. His short, stocky frame didn't command natural respect, but the sharp lines of his tailored suit and the deep furrow in his brow gave the impression of a man who tolerated no nonsense. His hawk-like eyes swept the crowd, searching for disturbances. After nearly 2 decades in this role, he prided himself on knowing when something or someone didn't belong. And then he saw her. She moved through the bustling mall as if she owned it, her every step a deliberate display of elegance and power. A voluminous fur coat swayed with her stride, turning heads wherever she passed. The oversized sunglasses concealed her eyes, but the unmistakable Harris-Walz cap perched on her head made her intentions loud and clear. The brand had been the center of public outrage for weeks, and its logo was enough to spark strong opinions on either side. Harold's jaw tightened at the sight. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. He wasn't the type to let provocations go unanswered, especially not when they happened under his roof. To him, this wasn't just a hat, it was a challenge. A direct affront to the neutral, family-friendly image he fought to maintain. He grabbed his radio from his belt. "Security, this is Greaves," he barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. "We've got a potential disruption near the main entrance. Woman in a fur coat, Harris-Walz cap. I want this handled quickly and discreetly. Over." As the woman strode past the atrium's fountain, Harold moved to intercept her. 2 security guards emerged from the crowd, closing in on either side of her. She noticed them but gave no indication of concern. Her companion, a younger woman in a sleek black ensemble and a face mask, watched cautiously but stayed silent. Harold approached with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. By the time he reached her, the tension in the air was palpable. Shoppers nearby slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the sudden confrontation. "Excuse me, ma'am," Harold began, forcing a polite smile as he positioned himself in front of her. "I'm Harold Greaves, the general manager of this mall. I need to speak with you about your choice of attire." The woman stopped mid-stride, tilting her head slightly. Her lips curled into a faint smile, though her eyes remained hidden behind the reflective lenses of her sunglasses. "And what exactly is the issue?" she asked, her tone calm but carrying a subtle edge. Harold straightened his tie, a nervous habit disguised as composure. "We strive to provide a welcoming environment for all our patrons. The Harris-Walz brand, as I'm sure you're aware, has been associated with controversy. I'm afraid your hat might provoke an unnecessary disturbance." The woman's smile didn't waver. If anything, it deepened, though it carried no warmth. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," she said slowly, her voice almost playful. "You're concerned that my hat is a problem because someone else might have a problem with it." "That's one way of putting it," Harold replied, folding his arms across his chest. "We have rules in place to ensure everyone feels comfortable here. I'm simply asking you to respect those rules." "And what rule exactly am I breaking?" Her question hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The younger woman at her side shifted uneasily, her hand gripping the strap of her designer handbag. The security guards exchanged uncertain glances but remained silent. "It's not about rules," Harold said quickly, his tone taking on a defensive edge. "It's about common sense and decency." "Ah, common sense and decency," she echoed, her smile widening. "Fascinating." Harold's patience thinned. He wasn't used to being questioned, let alone by someone so brazen. "Look, ma'am," he said firmly, "I'm giving you 2 options. You can remove the hat, or you can leave the premises." The crowd around them had grown, whispers spreading like wildfire. Shoppers paused to watch, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. The woman, however, seemed entirely unfazed. She reached up slowly, adjusting the brim of her hat as if to emphasize her defiance. "I see," she said, her voice light but laced with sarcasm. "And what happens if I choose neither?" "Then I'll have no choice but to escort you out," Harold said, his tone final. "I'm trying to be reasonable here, but I won't tolerate disruptions." She took a step closer, her heels clicking against the tiles. The security guard stiffened, and Harold instinctively leaned back. Despite her calm demeanor, there was something unsettling about her presence, something that made it impossible to look away. "You won't tolerate disruptions," she repeated, her voice soft but cutting. "Funny, I'm not the one creating a scene." Harold's face reddened, but he refused to back down. "Ma'am, I'm not going to argue with you. Either comply or leave. Those are your choices." The woman let out a low, amused chuckle, the sound dripping with condescension. "Well," she said, brushing an invisible speck of lint from her coat, "it seems you've made up your mind. Far be it from me to argue with authority." She turned sharply, her coat billowing behind her as she began walking toward the exit. Her companion followed silently, her expression unreadable. Harold watched them go, a mix of triumph and irritation bubbling in his chest. He didn't notice the murmurs spreading through the crowd or the pointed glances exchanged by onlookers. Had he been paying attention, he might have sensed the shift in atmosphere, a quiet undercurrent of anticipation that hinted at something far beyond his control. Harold stood in place, watching her walk away, but something gnawed at him. Her composed demeanor, her biting responses, it all felt like a challenge he hadn't quite overcome. The small crowd of onlookers whispered among themselves, glancing at him as if expecting more. For a man who prided himself on maintaining control, this wasn't the kind of scene he wanted to leave unresolved. With a huff, he gestured to the two security guards. "Follow her," Harold ordered. "I'll handle this myself." The guards exchanged wary glances but nodded. Harold straightened his suit jacket and marched after the woman, his shoes echoing against the floor. By now, she had made it halfway to the main exit, her fur coat billowing behind her like a cape. Her companion stayed close, her head low, as if she were trying to avoid the growing stares. "Ma'am," Harold called out, his voice louder than necessary. His tone cut through the murmurs of the crowd, drawing even more attention. Several shoppers slowed their pace, openly gawking now. "Ma'am, I'm not done speaking with you." The woman came to an abrupt stop, her shoulders squared. Slowly, she turned on her heel, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. Her sunglasses caught the overhead lights, masking her expression. The younger woman beside her reached out, placing a hand on her arm, but the gesture was met with a subtle shrug. She didn't need calming down. She was perfectly in control. "Yes," she said, her voice calm and almost bored. "Is there something else?" Harold caught up to her, his breathing slightly heavier than he would have liked. He forced a polite smile, though his jaw clenched. "I just want to ensure we're clear," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is private property. Refusal to comply with mall policies is grounds for removal." She tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "I believe I was already on my way out," she said smoothly. "Or have you decided to change the terms of your ultimatum?" Harold bristled. She wasn't just defiant. She was mocking him, and she wasn't even trying to hide it. His gaze flicked to her cap again, the bold Harris-Walz logo practically taunting him. "You're creating a scene," he said sharply. "This isn't about ultimatums. It's about respect for the rules." "Ah, respect," she said, drawing out the word as if tasting it. "That's rich, coming from someone who seems to enjoy throwing his weight around." Harold's face darkened. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she replied, her tone still infuriatingly composed. "You've made quite the spectacle of yourself, haven't you? All this fuss over a hat. I can only imagine how fragile your rules must be if they're threatened by a piece of fabric." The small crowd that had gathered nearby audibly reacted, soft gasps, a few muffled chuckles. Harold's cheeks flushed, the attention only fueling his frustration. He took a step closer, lowering his voice but not his intensity. "Listen here, ma'am. I don't care who you think you are. You're on my property, and you'll abide by my rules. Now, I'm giving you one last chance to comply before I escalate this further." Her smirk widened. "Escalate," she repeated, as if the word amused her. "And what exactly does that entail? Are you planning to call the police? Have me dragged out in handcuffs?" "Oh, do tell. I'm fascinated." Harold's grip tightened on his radio, his patience hanging by a thread. "Don't test me," he snapped. "You're not above the rules." Her companion, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Maybe we should just leave," she said quietly, her voice laced with unease. "It's not worth the trouble." The woman in the fur coat turned slightly, addressing her without breaking eye contact with Harold. "Oh, it's worth it," she said, her tone firm. "I don't take kindly to bullies." "Bullies?" Harold's voice cracked slightly, betraying his rising temper. "You're the one causing a disruption here." "Am I?" she countered, raising an eyebrow. She gestured toward the crowd of onlookers, who were now fully invested in the confrontation. "I wasn't the one who called for an audience. That was all you." Harold glanced around, realizing too late how much attention they had drawn. The crowd had grown, people craning their necks to get a better look. Some even held up their phones, recording the scene. His stomach tightened at the thought of this ending up online, a public spectacle undermining his authority. "Enough," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low but firm. "You're leaving. Now. And if you resist, I'll have security escort you out." "Escort me out," she repeated, her voice dripping with mock incredulity. "My, what a spectacle that would be. I can only imagine how well that would reflect on your precious mall." The younger woman tugged gently on her arm again, but the woman in the fur coat didn't budge. Harold's frustration boiled over. He turned to the security guards, who had been hovering uncertainly nearby. "Do your job," he snapped. "Remove her from the premises." The guards hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. One of them stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am," he began, his tone softer than Harold's. "We really don't want to escalate this. Could you please cooperate?" She turned her attention to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Then, she took a single step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tiles. The guard instinctively stepped back. "I'll leave when I'm ready," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. Not a moment sooner, the guard faltered, glancing back at Harold for direction. Harold's face was a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Are you seriously letting her?" "Enough," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest. She reached up and removed her sunglasses, revealing sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to hold the room captive. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Her words weren't shouted, but they echoed with authority, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Even Harold found himself momentarily speechless, his confidence faltering under her gaze. But he wasn't ready to back down, not yet. Harold's face twitched as he struggled to maintain composure. The woman's piercing gaze locked onto him, like a predator sizing up prey, and for a fleeting moment, he felt small, a sensation he despised. He had been in this position before, dealing with unruly patrons, but this was different. She wasn't panicked or flustered. She was calm, deliberate, and completely unbothered by the weight of his authority. "You don't seem to understand the gravity of your situation," Harold said, his voice tight. "This isn't a negotiation. You're trespassing now, and I have every right to have you forcibly removed." The woman's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "Trespassing? That's quite the escalation, don't you think? I seem to recall entering through the front door like everyone else. You were welcome here until you became a disruption." Harold shot back, his tone growing harsher. "That attitude. None of it belongs here. This is a place for families, for shoppers, not for statements." "Statements," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You think this is about making a statement?" She gestured toward her hat. "It's just a hat, Mr. Greaves. But you've turned it into something else entirely." "It's not just a hat," Harold snapped, his voice rising slightly. He immediately regretted it as a few murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Lowering his tone, he added, It's a symbol, one that stirs controversy, and I won't have it under my roof." Her smirk faded, replaced by a look of mock confusion. "And here I thought this was a public shopping center. You speak as though you own the place." Harold's chest puffed out, his pride bristling at the insinuation. "I run this mall," he said firmly. "I oversee every detail from security to customer experience. And I can tell you right now, you're not welcome here if you refuse to follow the rules." Her companion stepped closer, her voice soft but insistent. "Maybe we should just go," she said, casting a wary glance at the growing crowd. "This isn't worth it." The woman in the fur coat didn't even turn her head. "Go," she said, her tone dripping with disbelief. "And let him think he can push people around unchecked." "I don't think so." Harold clenched his fists, struggling to keep his irritation in check. "Let me make this very clear," he said, each word clipped. "You can either remove the hat and walk out on your own, or I will call the police to deal with this matter." Her laughter rang out, startling those closest to her. It wasn't loud, but it carried a sharpness that made Harold's face flush with anger. "The police?" she repeated, her voice laced with amusement. "Oh, that's rich. Tell me, Mr. Greaves, what exactly will you tell them? That a woman in a fur coat hurt your feelings?" The crowd couldn't contain themselves this time. Scattered chuckles erupted, quickly stifled by nervous glances at Harold's reddening face. He turned to the security guards, his frustration bubbling over. "Do your job," he barked, pointing a finger at the woman. "Remove her from the premises. Now." The guards hesitated. One of them, a younger man with a name tag that read Cole, took a tentative step forward. "Ma'am," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "We really don't want this to escalate any further. If you could just—" She raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. "Tell me something, Cole," she said, her voice smooth and unhurried. "Do you enjoy working here?" The guard blinked, caught off guard by the question. I mean, it's fine, I guess." "And do you find it fulfilling," she continued, "to take orders from a man who can't seem to handle a little public scrutiny?" "Excuse me," Harold cut in, his voice rising again. "You will not undermine my authority in front of my staff." "Your authority," she said, finally turning her full attention back to him. "You mean the authority you so desperately cling to because it's the only thing that gives your life meaning?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Harold's face turned a deep shade of red, his hands trembling at his sides. "You're out of line," he hissed. "This is harassment, plain and simple." "Oh, harassment," she said, drawing out the word as though savoring its taste. "That's an interesting accusation, coming from the man who's been following me around, barking orders and making demands." "You've made this a spectacle," Harold shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of his anger. "You could have walked out quietly. But no, you had to make it about yourself. And you couldn't resist the chance to play the hero, could you?" She shot back, her tone sharp and cutting. The brave manager defending his sacred mall from the horrors of a hat. Harold's radio crackled to life, a voice on the other end asking for an update. He ignored it, his focus locked on the woman in front of him. "You're testing my patience," he growled. "I will not ask again." "Good," she said, her voice icy, "because I'm done listening." The crowd grew restless, the tension in the air almost tangible. Phones were out now, their cameras capturing every second of the heated exchange. Harold noticed them too late. The thought of this confrontation going viral sent a chill down his spine, but he couldn't back down. Not now, not with so many eyes on him. "You want to play this game?" he said, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "Fine, but when the authorities arrive, don't say I didn't warn you." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You do whatever you need to do, Mr. Greaves. Just know this, I don't lose." Her words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Harold clenched his jaw, turning away to grab his phone. The crowd shifted, their murmurs growing louder as the standoff dragged on. But she remained still, her posture unwavering, her presence commanding the room. She wasn't just winning the argument. She was dismantling Harold piece by piece, and he didn't even realize it. Harold tapped furiously at his phone, his fingers trembling as he scrolled to find the mall security command line. The woman stood motionless, her fur coat making her appear larger than life, her presence towering over him despite their difference in physical size. The small crowd that had gathered was no longer subtle. Phones were out, cameras rolling, and the soft hum of whispers had turned into open commentary. "She's owning him," someone muttered nearby, their words biting into Harold's ears like venom. His neck burned with embarrassment, but he refused to let it show. This was his mall, his turf, and this woman had no right to make a spectacle of him. "I've had enough of your games," Harold snapped, lowering his phone but keeping a firm grip on it. He gestured sharply to the security guards, who hovered like indecisive statues. "Cole Johnson, I'm not asking, I'm telling. Remove her, now." The younger guard, Cole, hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously between Harold and the woman. "Sir, I don't think. That wasn't a request." Harold's voice cracked, the edge of desperation creeping in. "Do your job, or I'll find someone who will." "Careful, Harold," the woman interjected, her voice cutting through his like a blade. "Your temper's starting to show. Not very professional of you, is it?" Harold whipped around to face her, his finger jabbing the air between them. "Don't you dare lecture me on professionalism," he barked. "You've disrupted my mall, harassed my staff, and refused to leave when asked. You're nothing but a self-important." "Careful," she said again, her tone dropping into something quieter, sharper. "Choose your next words wisely." The crowd let out an audible "ooh," the sound rippling like a wave. Harold's face burned. "Or what?" he shot back, his voice rising. "What are you going to do? File a complaint? Call a lawyer? Go ahead. I've seen it all before." "Oh, I don't need to call anyone," she replied smoothly. "You're doing a fine job digging your own grave." The smirk on her lips was infuriating. It wasn't just confidence, it was control. She wasn't rattled, wasn't backing down, and it was driving Harold mad. He turned back to the guards, his frustration spilling over. "Are you going to stand there all day?" he snarled. "Get her out of here." Cole stepped forward reluctantly, his hands raised in a gesture of appeasement. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Let's just—" "Harder for who?" she interrupted, her voice cold. "You." And she gestured to Harold with a tilt of her chin. "Don't let his incompetence drag you down with him." Cole froze, caught in the crossfire. Harold, however, lunged forward, pointing directly at her. "That's it," he bellowed. "You're done. I've had it with your—" "Harold," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself," he spat, his face now a deep shade of crimson. "You're the one causing a scene, parading around in your ridiculous coat and your stupid hat like you're some kind of—" "Some kind of what?" she cut in sharply, her tone suddenly icy. The crowd went silent, the tension palpable. "Go on, say it." Harold opened his mouth, but no words came out. Her stare was unrelenting, her presence suffocating. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Not that he was wrong, but that maybe, just maybe, he'd underestimated her. "I don't have to justify myself to you," he said finally, though the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "You've overstepped, and I'm handling it." "Handling it," she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call this little tantrum? I'd hate to see what it looks like when you lose control entirely." The crowd murmured again, their whispers growing louder. A few even laughed outright, the sound stoking Harold's fury. "Enough of this," he roared. "You're leaving. Guards, take her out now." "Harold, stop!" A new voice cut through the chaos. It was Johnson, the older of the two guards. He stepped forward, his hand raised to calm his boss. "This isn't worth it. Look around." Harold glanced at the crowd, and for the first time, he fully grasped the gravity of the situation. Dozens of phones were trained on him, recording every word, every gesture. The faces in the crowd weren't just curious. They were entertained, and worse, judgmental. He could feel their scorn, their amusement at his expense. His stomach churned. "Don't tell me what's worth it," Harold snapped, turning on Johnson. "You're here to follow orders, not give opinions." "Then maybe you should think about the orders you're giving," Johnson said evenly. "This is turning into a circus." "A circus?" Harold spat. "Because she's refusing to follow the rules? That's her fault, not mine." The woman let out a soft laugh, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. "Oh, Harold," she said, shaking her head. "You really don't see it, do you?" "See what?" he demanded, his voice raw with frustration. "This isn't about rules," she said, taking a deliberate step closer. "This is about you. Your need to control, to assert your authority over someone who doesn't bow to it. You're not enforcing order. You're feeding your own ego." Harold's mouth opened, then closed again. The word struck a nerve, though he refused to let it show. "That's rich," he said finally, "coming from someone who..." "Who what?" she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Who doesn't fall in line? Who doesn't shrink under your bluster? I'm sorry if that offends your delicate sensibilities, but I don't answer to you. You answer to mall policy," Harold shouted. "And as long as you're under this roof, you'll follow it." "Your roof," she said, her smirk returning. Interesting choice of words. Her companion, who had been silent for most of the exchange, stepped forward again. "Maybe we should really go," she whispered urgently. "It's getting out of hand." "Oh, it's been out of hand," the woman replied, her eyes still locked on Harold. "But I'm not leaving until he learns a lesson." The word sent a ripple through the crowd, their whispers turning into hushed exclamations. Harold's hands balled into fists at his sides. "Lesson," he hissed. "The only lesson here is that no one is above the rules, not even you." "Then teach me," she said, her tone almost challenging. "Let's see how far you're willing to go." The tension in the air had thickened, nearly suffocating. By now, the crowd had doubled, forming a semicircle around the confrontation, phones raised high like digital witnesses ready to broadcast the spectacle to the world. Harold stood at the center of it all, his face red, his breathing shallow. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, some waiting for him to triumph, but most hoping for him to fail. The woman adjusted her fur coat, the motion slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving Harold's face. "I can't decide," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "Is this display of yours about protecting mall policies, or just your fragile ego?" "You're testing my patience," Harold hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "This has nothing to do with me. It's about rules. Something people like you think don't apply to them. People like me," she repeated, her tone laced with quiet menace. "Care to elaborate on that, Harold? What exactly do you mean by people like me?" The question hung in the air, daring him to answer. Harold faltered for a split second, his confidence wavering under the weight of her words and the murmurs of the crowd. He could feel the audience turning against him, their sympathy shifting toward the woman he had tried so hard to vilify. "You know exactly what I mean," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "No, I don't think I do," she replied, taking a step closer. "Why don't you spell it out for everyone here? After all, they're watching, listening, waiting." Harold's face flushed even deeper. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're not going to twist this into something it's not." "Oh, I'm not twisting anything," she said, her voice steady, but with an edge that cut through his bravado. "I'm just exposing it." The crowd murmured louder now, some nodding in agreement, others filming even closer. A young man in a hoodie, clearly emboldened by the woman's defiance, called out, "Why don't you just leave her alone, man? She's not doing anything wrong." Harold spun toward the voice, his frustration spilling over. "Stay out of this," he barked, his finger jabbing in the young man's direction. "This doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," the woman interjected smoothly. "Because you've made it public, Harold. You've turned this into a spectacle, a power play, and now you're losing." "I'm not losing," Harold shouted, his voice cracking. "You're just another entitled." "Careful," she cut him off, her tone sharp enough to slice through the chaos. "You've already shown everyone here who you are. Do you really want to keep digging?" The crowd erupted in murmurs again, this time louder, more pointed. Words like arrogant and power trip floated through the air, directed squarely at Harold. He could feel the shift, the undeniable truth that the narrative had slipped out of his control. His chest tightened. "You don't belong here," Harold said, his voice quieter but no less venomous. "You think you can walk in, flaunt your privilege, and break the rules because of some misplaced sense of superiority. But not in my mall. Privilege," she said, her eyebrows arching in mock surprise. "Is that what this is about? Fascinating how people like you love to project." The crowd let out an audible "oh," their whispers turning into outright laughter. Harold's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He opened his mouth to retort, but she didn't give him the chance. "Let's talk about privilege, shall we?" she continued, her voice louder now, meant for the audience as much as for him. "Privilege is being a middle-aged man in a cheap suit, thinking you can police other people's existence just because you've been handed a tiny scrap of authority. Privilege is assuming your rules, your comfort, are more important than anyone else's freedom to express themselves. That's not," Harold started, but she raised her hand, silencing him. "Privilege," she went on, her words sharp and deliberate, "is calling yourself a defender of neutrality while enforcing arbitrary policies that only serve your own biases. Let's be honest, Harold. You're not afraid of my hat. You're afraid of what it represents. You're afraid of change." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the atrium. Harold's jaw dropped, his face a mask of disbelief. He turned to the security guards, his desperation now fully exposed. "Are you just going to stand there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Do something." Cole took a hesitant step forward but stopped short. The older guard, Johnson, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, shaking his head. "This is a bad look, Harold," Johnson said quietly. "You're making it worse." "I'm not making it worse," Harold snapped, his voice shrill. She's winning," the woman offered, her smile returning. "Oh, don't worry, Harold. I'm not done yet." The applause hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown louder. More voices joined in, shouting phrases like "leave her alone," and "you're the problem, not her." Harold's vision blurred with fury and humiliation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "You think you're so clever," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "But you're just a bully hiding behind a crowd." "Bully," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "Oh, Harold, sweetie, you approach me. You're the one who turned this into a public spectacle. If you don't like the attention, maybe next time you should think before picking a fight you can't win." The crowd cheered again, some even whistling. Harold's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He was too far gone now, his humiliation complete. Still, he refused to give in. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Oh, I know," she replied, her smile widening. "But it's getting closer." The crowd roared, their energy feeding into the chaos. Harold stood frozen, his authority crumbling around him, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a tidal wave. And yet, he still clung to the last shreds of his pride, even as they slipped through his fingers. The applause hadn't subsided. It surged like waves, carrying whispers and jeers that grew louder with every passing second. Harold stood rooted in place, his mind racing as he clung desperately to what little remained of his authority. His heart pounded against his chest, each beat a painful reminder of how thoroughly the situation had spiraled out of control. The woman adjusted her hat, the bold Harris-Walz logo catching the light. Her companion leaned closer, whispering something into her ear, but she waved it off with a flick of her wrist. She wasn't going anywhere, not until she was done. "This is harassment," Harold said, his voice breaking slightly. He pointed at her, his hand trembling with frustration. "You're turning this into a circus, and you know it." "Oh, Harold," she said with mock pity, tilting her head as if she were addressing a tantrum-throwing child. "You're the one who brought the clowns." The crowd howled with laughter, their voices blending into a cacophony that drowned out Harold's retort. Phones were still up, capturing every humiliating second. The word "clowns" rippled through the crowd like an anthem, whispered, laughed, and repeated with glee. Harold's face burned so hot he thought he might combust. "Enough!" he roared, his voice cracking as he raised his arms in an attempt to silence the crowd. "This isn't some debate club. This is a private establishment, and I have the right to enforce the rules as I see fit." "That's the problem, Harold," the woman said, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the tile, her presence as commanding as ever. "You think your rules are the law, but you're not a judge, and this mall isn't a courtroom. You don't get to dictate who belongs and who doesn't. I don't have to justify myself to you." Harold shot back, though his voice lacked its earlier bravado. "You're in violation of our policies, and that's all there is to it." "Policies," she repeated, arching a brow. "Name one." "Go on, Harold. Tell everyone here exactly which policy prohibits a hat." Harold opened his mouth, then closed it again. His mind raced, scrambling for an answer, but none came. The truth was, there wasn't one. He'd acted out of instinct, out of prejudice, and now he was backed into a corner with no escape. "That's what I thought," she said, her tone icy. "You're not enforcing policies. You're enforcing your own insecurities." The crowd erupted again, their cheers and laughter ringing out like a victory bell. Harold felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders. He turned to the security guards, desperate for backup. "Do something," he barked. "I'm not paying you to stand there." Cole shuffled awkwardly, his eyes darting between Harold and the woman. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "maybe we should just de-escalate." "De-escalate?" Harold spat, his voice shrill. "She's the one escalating. She's the one refusing to cooperate. This is her fault, not mine." "Her fault?" The woman let out a sharp laugh, the sound dripping with derision. "That's rich. You've been barking orders and throwing tantrums since the moment you saw me. And now you want to play the victim? Pathetic." Harold's entire body shook with rage. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think you can walk in here and do whatever you want because you've got a fancy coat and a big mouth. I think," she said, taking another step forward, "that you're a small man with a small mind, clinging to whatever scraps of power you can find. And I think you're terrified of anyone who doesn't fit neatly into your little box." The crowd cheered again, their voices echoing through the atrium. Harold's vision blurred with anger and humiliation. He was losing them, had already lost them, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so smug, so confident, So what? He demanded, his voice trembling. "You think you're better than me? Is that it?" "No, Harold," she said, her voice dropping into something quieter, more dangerous. "I don't think I'm better than you. I know I am." The crowd's reaction was deafening. Cheers, applause, laughter. It all blended into a single roar that filled the space, drowning out Harold's protests. He turned in a frantic circle, his hands raised as if to plead for order. But it was hopeless. The narrative had shifted entirely, and he was no longer in control. "I've had enough of this," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm calling the police. Right now." "Oh, please do," the woman said, folding her arms across her chest. "In fact, I insist. Let's see how that call plays out, shall we? You can explain to them, and to everyone watching, why you're so threatened by a woman in a hat." Harold hesitated, his phone halfway out of his pocket. He could feel the crowd's eyes on him, their judgment pressing down like a physical weight. He knew what would happen if he made the call. The woman was right, they wouldn't take his side. Not when the entire incident was already plastered across social media, painted as a power-hungry manager harassing an innocent woman. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. "I don't care," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is my mall, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." "Protect it from what?" She shot back, her voice rising. "From hats? From women who refuse to cower? Or from the truth that your so-called authority is nothing more than an illusion?" The crowd cheered louder than ever, their energy feeding into the chaos. Harold's hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, his fingers trembling too much to dial. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his humiliation crushing him, but he still couldn't stop. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Oh, Harold," she said, her smile returning. "You already do." Harold's hands trembled as he finally managed to dial the number. The murmurs from the crowd, the flashing phones, the derisive laughter, it all blurred into a cacophony that made his head pound. His fingers hovered over the call button, but before he could press it, her voice cut through the chaos once more. "Go ahead, Harold," she said, her tone calm but razor-sharp. "Make the call. I'd love to hear you explain this to the authorities." Harold froze. He could feel the crowd closing in, their stares searing into his back. He knew how this would look, how it already looked. He was the villain of the moment, the power-hungry manager who had crossed the line. But he couldn't let her win. Not like this. "You don't scare me," he snapped, though his voice cracked under the strain. "You're just another entitled." "Entitled?" she interrupted, her tone rising for the first time. She stepped forward, her presence looming large. "Oh, Harold, you have no idea who you're dealing with." Her companion stepped back, her expression unreadable, as if even she could sense the shift in the air. The crowd leaned in, their collective anticipation hanging like a storm cloud about to burst. "You've spent the last 20 minutes barking orders, flaunting your so-called authority, and embarrassing yourself in front of your employees and customers," the woman continued, her voice steady but full of venom. "And for what? A hat, a symbol you don't even understand. It's about rules," Harold shouted, his face a deep shade of crimson. "It's about—" "No, Harold," she cut him off sharply. "It's about your ego, your need to control, to dominate, to feel like you matter in a world that's left you behind." The crowd erupted again, their cheers and laughter blending into a deafening roar. Harold's chest heaved, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to do anything to regain control. But she wasn't done. "Do you know what's funny?" she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "You've spent this entire time trying to assert your authority, trying to remind everyone that this is your mall. But there's just one problem with that." She reached into the pocket of her fur coat and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. The crowd quieted slightly, their curiosity piqued, as she flipped it open and withdrew a card. She held it up for everyone to see, the bold logo of Harris-Walz Properties gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "This mall," she said, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a verdict, "is mine." The crowd gasped as the realization swept through them like wildfire. Phones shot higher into the air, capturing every second of Harold's humiliation. His mouth fell open, his eyes darting between the card in her hand and her face, which now bore a look of cold satisfaction. "You're lying," he said, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. "That's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible," she replied, her tone dripping with mock pity. "Harris-Walz owns this entire property. Every store, every corridor, every inch of tile you've been stomping around on. And as of last month, I own Harris-Walz." The crowd erupted into chaos, cheers, laughter, shouts of disbelief. Harold staggered back, his knees buckling slightly as the weight of her words crashed over him. He turned to the security guards, his desperation now fully exposed. "She's lying," he stammered, his voice trembling. She's making this up." "Actually," the older guard, Johnson, interjected. "She's not." Harold whipped around to face him. "What are you talking about?" "I've seen her picture in the corporate memos," Johnson said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of satisfaction. "She's the new CEO. Her name's been all over the updates." Harold's head snapped back toward her, his eyes wide with disbelief. She tilted her head slightly, as if to acknowledge Johnson's words. "Nice to see someone's been paying attention," she said smoothly. "This can't be happening," Harold muttered, his voice barely audible. His knees gave out, and he slumped against the counter of a nearby kiosk, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. "Oh, but it is," she said, stepping closer. "You see, Harold, I could have walked away. I could have let you dig your little hole, and left you to stew in your own mediocrity. But then you made it personal. You decided that your pride was more important than my dignity. And for that, there are consequences. The crowd cheered louder than ever, their energy feeding into the moment. Harold's chest heaved as he struggled to form a coherent response. But nothing came. He was finished, and he knew it. "I want you out of here," she said, her tone final. "Clean out your office. Turn in your keys. You're done. You can't do this." Harold stammered, his voice cracking. "I've been here for 20 years, and that's 20 years too long," she interrupted. "Effective immediately, you're no longer employed by Harris-Walz Properties. Consider this your formal notice." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the atrium. Harold sank to his knees, his face pale, his humiliation complete. The woman turned on her heel, her fur coat billowing behind her as she strode toward the exit. Her companion followed silently, a small smile tugging at her lips. As she reached the doors, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Harold," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You might want to rethink how you treat people in the future. Not everyone will be as kind as I was." And with that, she was gone, leaving Harold to face the crowd and his disgrace alone. The crowd didn't disperse. If anything, it grew, the murmurs swelling into a cacophony of disbelief, amusement, and outright ridicule. Phones were still trained on Harold, capturing his every move, or lack thereof. He remained slumped against the kiosk, his hands gripping the edge as though the polished wood might somehow anchor him to reality. But reality was slipping away, and fast. "Did you see that? She owns them all. I can't believe he tried to kick her out. This is going to be all over TikTok." The words hit him like physical blows, each one stripping away the last shreds of his dignity. Harold's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. He had spent decades building his reputation, carving out a sense of authority in a world that didn't always respect him. And now, in less than an hour, it was all gone. "Harold," Johnson said, his voice cutting through the chaos. He crouched down beside his former boss, his expression unreadable. "You need to leave. The longer you stay here, the worse it's going to get." "Leave?" Harold croaked, his voice barely audible. "Where am I supposed to go?" Johnson shrugged, his tone colder than it had been before. "Anywhere but here." The word stung. Johnson had always been loyal, one of the few employees Harold thought he could count on. But now, even he was turning away. Harold glanced up at the crowd, his vision blurring as he realized just how many cameras were still pointed at him. Dozens of faces stared back, some amused, others indifferent, but none sympathetic. He was a spectacle, a meme in the making. "Go home, man," Cole added, his voice softer but no less firm. "This isn't going to end well if you stick around." Harold's hands tightened on the edge of the kiosk, his knuckles turning white. I can't just leave," he muttered. "This is my mall. I've given everything to this place." "It's not yours anymore," Johnson said bluntly, standing to his full height. She made that pretty clear. Harold felt something inside him crack. His eyes darted to the crowd again, and he saw someone laughing, their phone tilted slightly as they filmed him. A fresh wave of humiliation washed over him, and before he could stop himself, he lurched to his feet. "You think this is funny?" he shouted, his voice hoarse and ragged. "You think I'm some kind of joke?" The laughter only grew louder. Someone in the back shouted, "Yeah, we do," and the crowd roared with approval. Harold's vision blurred again, this time with tears he refused to shed. He turned toward the exit, his steps unsteady, his body shaking with anger and despair. As he stumbled through the mall, the whispers followed him like ghosts. Every person he passed seemed to be talking about him, their faces etched with judgment. He reached the parking lot, the cold air biting at his flushed skin. His car sat where he had left it, a beat-up sedan that seemed to mock him with its rusted edges and peeling paint. Harold fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling so badly that he dropped them onto the asphalt. He bent down to retrieve them, his knees aching as he did, and and that's when he heard it. The buzz of an incoming notification. It wasn't his phone. It was the large digital screen mounted on the side of the mall, usually used to advertise sales and events. Harold looked up, squinting against the glare of the screen, and froze. His own face stared back at him, pale and frantic, caught in the worst possible angle. The video was already edited, a bold caption plastered across the top. Mall manager's meltdown goes viral. "No," Harold whispered, his voice cracking. "No, no, no." The video played on a loop, showing him pointing at the woman, yelling incoherently as she calmly dismantled him with her words. The crowd's cheers and laughter echoed from the screen speakers, making the humiliation all the more visceral. Harold staggered backward, his hands covering his ears. But it was no use. The sound was everywhere, bouncing off the walls of his mind. The screen wasn't just a local feed. It was connected to the mall's social media accounts, meaning the video was already online, being shared and reposted at lightning speed. Harold's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't dare look at it. He knew what he would find. Messages from friends, family, maybe even his wife, all asking the same thing.